なんでどうしてこの孤独は誰にとって必要なの?
The Yakuza series has had more than its fair share of spin-offs, including Edo period Jidaigeki titles Kenzan and Ishin, the teenage delinquent-led Kurohyo duology, aka Black Panther, a Fist of the North Star game, and even a zombie apocalypse alternate timeline, which, for a long time, was the only spin-off that got localized to the States. However, in 2019, the Ryuga Gotoku franchise got a huge shakeup with a new spin-off that offered a refreshing perspective on life in the familiar Kamurocho, by putting players on the side of the law, quite literally as Takayuki Yagami, a former lawyer turned private detective in Judgment, or Judge Eyes as it was called in Japan. The game drew a lot of attention for plenty of reasons, but the biggest one was its lead star, the one and only Takuya Kimura, one of the most famous men in the land of the rising sun. He was one of the members of SMAP, an immensely successful boy band founded in 1988 and disbanded in 2016. But he became a highly admired and sought-after actor both on stage and on the screen during those years as well. But despite his unparalleled popularity, he never once starred in a video game, presumably because no one could afford him or perhaps even draw his attention to the medium. But that changed with Judgment, which not only uses his likeness, but his voice as well. And that massive achievement of acquiring such a noteworthy talent paid off in spades, as Judgment was a critical and financial success, without question the most popular spin-off title the Yakuza universe has had so far. I also loved it, and if I had been making videos in 2019, it would have been in my top 5 games of that year, alongside Devil May Cry 5, Resident Evil 2, Final Fantasy XIV Shadowbringers, and Death Stranding. Now, 2 years later, we've received an official follow-up in Lost Judgment, with Kimura reprising his role as the relentless lawyer-turned-detective Yagami. Several other characters from the first game return as well, including Yagami's friend and detective partner, Kaito, and the entire team at the Genda Law Office. Furthermore, Lost Judgment is the first time in the history of the Yakuza franchise that a game is given a simultaneous worldwide release. Prior to this, games would release in Japan first and then the rest of the world several months later. Aside from Yakuza 5, which is a special case with a very long gap, the longest wait us Western fans have had to endure is about 1 full year. But that isn't the case here, and this move could be substantial for the future of the franchise. This could be Sega finally and fully committing to Ryuga Gotoku Studio being their all-star team and giving them and their flagship games a much higher priority on the business side. After all, RGG Studio releases a game almost every single year, and somehow manages to knock it out of the park almost every single time, the opposite of some other teams under Sega's roof. Unfortunately, despite the Judgment games proving to be so popular, the spin-off's future is in jeopardy due to a rumored issue revolving around Kimura's talent agency, Johnny & Associates, being disgustingly protective of the actor's likeness, to the point where they're demanding that Sega never release a PC version so that the model of Yagami cannot be ripped from the game and subsequently used in unapproved fan-made content. It's weird and invasive, but sadly par for the course on J&A's part. So, with a drearily uncertain path laid before RGG Studio regarding the Judgment series, it's best for all of us fans to savor this newest game as if it were the last, because it very well could be. But just how savory is it? Let's get into the review and find out. Lost Judgment takes place 3 years after the events of the previous game, with Yagami and Kaito still active detectives in Kamurocho, and in the middle of fulfilling an infidelity case. They're soon given a case by the chairman of Seiryo High School in Isazaki Ijincho, hoping to discover a bullying issue within the student body. However, through contact with their friends over at Genda Law Office, the two are suddenly pulled into a strange situation. A disgraced police officer, Akihiro Ehara, found guilty of sexual battery on public transit, who, after receiving his verdict, reveals his knowledge of a dead body and its identity in Ijincho, before the discovery of the corpse was even made public. Yagami eventually finds threads that potentially connect Ehara's case to the bullying inside Seiryo High. But how deep does this connection go, and who is truly behind it all? An important theme of the narrative, if not its main theme, is the imperfection and downright incompetence of the law, and how its lack of reliability leads people down the wrong path in the search for justice. It's a fairly common subject in stories like these, but Lost Judgment tackles it in a way I don't think I've ever seen before. It's a story that starts off pretty straightforward, but as many crime thrillers do, more and more layers are peeled back to uncover a grander and possibly more heinous scheme. The game does a great job of adding on the intrigue without becoming too chaotic and accidentally tangling its own plot up in its own enthusiasm to show more. It's paced in such a way that you feel like you're trying to solve the case alongside Yagami, as opposed to reaching a clear conclusion early on and then waiting for him to follow up, which is how the first game went from my perspective. Granted, some parts of the unraveling story might be a tad bit confusing, but the overarching mystery is delivered in a manner that's not an active challenge to follow. It's an enthralling drama that maintained my interest as more questions popped up and gripped me as they finally received answers. It's difficult to discuss the characters in this game, especially the newcomers, without going into spoiler territory. But I will say that one of the plot's main antagonists is one of the best villains we've seen so far in the entire Yakuza universe. Mainly because many people who play this game will probably find themselves personally siding with this character despite being forced to go against them as Yagami. I'd even go so far as to say that I would like them to be a playable character in the future in some shape or form. As for the setting, the vast majority of the game is set in Yokohama, specifically Isazaki Ijincho, the new district that debuted in Like a Dragon. It's meant to be the new main setting for the franchise from here on out, replacing the role that Kamurocho once had as the Yakuza universe's home. It's about 2 or 3 times larger, but has a distinctly different feel to it. However, this doesn't mean Kamurocho is completely abandoned. It was still present and explorable to an extent in Like a Dragon, and it returns here in Lost Judgment as well, but thankfully there's a little bit more to do, and you're allowed many opportunities to return to it. That being said, 90% of your time will still be spent in Ijincho, but there's one specific thing that's new to this district that wasn't in Like a Dragon: Seiryo High School. It was totally absent from the game's map in Ichiban's adventure last year, but it's here now to contribute to Yagami's case, and it's actually a major addition to the setting. It's a fully realized, lifelike high school that seems to be on a 1-to-1 scale, or close to that at least, with real-life Japanese high schools, including 4 accessible floors and roof, a gymnasium, a large patio area, a basement floor, and several accessible classrooms and club rooms. Despite being only one building, it feels like a substantial increase to Ijincho's size. Now, you may be wondering what kind of content the school offers, but you just wait. We will get to that in a bit. Like the last several games in the franchise, including its own predecessor, Lost Judgment runs on RGG Studios' own Dragon Engine, which is given a chance to flex its muscles a bit on the PlayStation 5 version of the game that I've been playing on. The game offers 2 performance modes, as we've come to expect from games nowadays. One that prioritizes frame rate and aims for a constant 60 frames per second, and one that prioritizes resolution while being capped at 30. The nice part about this choice is that it's available from the settings menu at any point in the game and doesn't require you to leave to the main menu and reset the game for changes to take effect. In fact, the change is pretty much instant, but the actual change itself isn't all that drastic. Prioritizing resolution does offer a sharper image and greater detail in environmental and especially character model textures. However, I don't think it's anywhere near drastic enough to make the frame rate sacrifice worthwhile. The game still looks very good when prioritizing frame rate, and the smoothness of that 60 frames per second really comes into play during combat, which maintains the original real-time beat-em-up mechanics from before the main series shift to turn-based gameplay, featuring lots of flashy, colorful particle effects and moves that involve tight timing. I think with a little bit more time, RGG Studio could have further optimized the game to the point where a choice isn't needed at all, but this is probably a consequence of Lost Judgment being a cross-generation title. Regardless of the performance setting though, it's a great looking game with a remarkably detailed world. Since I played on PlayStation 5, there are a few other things to mention. Haptic feedback does exist, but it's in a pretty subdued form. It mostly feels like regular rumble, with the only real exception being the vibration given when Yagami receives a text message. It's a pretty convincing shake that does a good job of mimicking a normal phone. The increased trigger resistance is present though, but unless I'm misremembering, I think it's exclusive to specific minigames. I don't recall feeling it during normal gameplay and combat. In regard to loading times, Lost Judgment is quite fast. It's not bordering on instantaneous like some games I've played earlier in the year like Resident Evil Village or Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart. But loading into a game from the main menu or taking a taxi to the opposite side of the city takes about 5 to 7 seconds to load, which is still a substantial improvement compared to the 30-40 seconds or more it would take on PlayStation 4 with a stock 5400 RPM hard drive. Generally speaking, the game doesn't fully utilize every tiny hardware feature offered by the console, but it's still a beautiful experience that maintains a consistent level of performance. It never crashed, stalled, or froze, and I don't think I've ever seen any particularly egregious frame rate drops. The music in the Yakuza franchise has always been a pretty strong highlight to its presentation as well, and Lost Judgment is no different. It features a large collection of incredibly catchy tunes and banging boss themes that get the blood pumping. Lots of slick electronic beats and tense strings make some of the coolest fights even cooler. The track Viper is a super menacing song for one of the more ice-cold antagonists in the franchise, and the track KOG sounds like a dark synth track you'd probably hear at some moody club. And Unwavering Belief is a suitably epic cut that rightfully closes out the game. If you're already familiar with the Yakuza franchise, or at least the previous Judgment game, then you already know what to expect gameplay-wise. A sprawling open-world city district with a ton of things to do, story-related or otherwise. But since the mainline series has moved over to turn-based combat, Judgment is the only spin-off left clinging to the original real-time beat-em-up action that these games started off with. Yagami's fighting style in the first game was quite fast-paced, and that remains the same here in the sequel. He has his crane fighting style, which is best for crowd control and fighting numerous opponents at once, and his tiger style, which is focused on power and is best for one-on-one encounters. However, Lost Judgment introduces a third fighting style into the mix, Snake, which is focused heavily on parrying and opening your opponents up for counters, taking the old saying, the best offense is a good defense, to its absolute limit. All three fighting styles are accessible at any moment and you can freely switch between them to your heart's content. In fact, there are unlockable skills and abilities acquired by spending SP in the smartphone pause menu that encourage the use of frequent switching, if you're into that. If not, you're still more than welcome to stick to one style for practically the entire game. I spent much of my time in crane style due to its extremely generous dodging capabilities. But there's also uses for Tiger Style's immense power and super armor that allows Yagami to tank hits and resist staggering. Snake can also be very fun for those who like to stand in one place and play the patient game. Each style has their own strengths that make them fun to use. There's also a new mechanic called Mortal Reversals, which are big counterattacks that occur the moment you dodge a nasty attack that the enemy performs. You'll know the appropriate attack is coming because your foe will have a big, bright, threatening aura around them that's basically impossible to miss. When it comes out, simply step to the side, press the grab button, and Yagami performs a fancy reversal that does a massive amount of damage. If you want to play it safe, it's generally still possible to just turn tail and run without risking getting hit in order to perform the reversal, but it's pretty satisfying to pull off. And doing it with the generous crane-style dodge makes performing the task almost trivial. If I have one gripe with this mechanic, it's that Yagami only has one animation for it, and you see it every single time you do it. It gets a little boring after a while. The QuickTime events that play out during the middle of boss fights are also given an overhaul. Instead of one button prompt at a time showing up, you're given anywhere from 2 to 5 buttons to hit in a timed sequence. and the directional inputs are pretty unreliable, at least when you're using an analog stick. I failed a few of these simply because the game thought I pushed the analog stick in a different direction, and in one case, I actually failed a QTE because the game thought that the analog stick returning to a neutral position was an input in itself. Pretty weird. A very minor gripe I have is more of an observation. I noticed a lot of the usual healing items have been taken out. There's only the basic level Tauriners, Staminans, and Toughnesses available for purchase, and you can only hold 3 of each. You can hoard a bunch of food and use those to heal, but most of them give you only a sliver of recovery, so you'll likely end up wolfing down 5 or more for an adequate heal. It's not that big of a deal, but it comes off as an arbitrary limitation and also takes away avenues with which we can spend our hard-earned money. As this is a game where you play as a detective, you're obviously going to be doing some sleuthing here and there, and those tasks include things like tailing people, searching for clues in small designated areas, photographing criminals in the act, interrogating suspects and revealing evidence, chasing down perps who attempt to flee, sneaking through areas with many enemies, and parkour. Judgment had most of these bite-sized minigames about 2 years ago, but a couple of these are new, but not all of them are equally underlined as something crucial to the experience. One of the biggest complaints about not only the previous game, but any game with this mechanic in general, is that tailing missions suck. They are rarely, if ever, fun. They're typically seen as a task you have to tolerate at best, or an actively unfun chore at worst. Thankfully, tailing missions in Judgment are very rare and very quick, typically lasting only about 3 to 5 minutes. In my 45 hours of playtime, I've only done 4, maybe 5 tailing missions, and they were a breeze. Nothing to complain about, but nothing to praise either. If RGG Studio can't make tailing missions fun, then I don't know who can. As for investigating crime scenes, the game gives you multiple tools. Aside from Yagami's own naked eyes, we have a camera, which is used to photograph criminals in the act from time to time, a long, powerful microphone for eavesdropping from a distance, and a bug detector for finding any spy devices placed by enemies. It's a fairly frequent occurrence where Yagami will have to go into a first-person perspective to scope out clues and decide where to go next. It's a basic procedure that doesn't really add or detract much from the experience. It's just kinda there. Unfortunately, they're not implemented into direct gameplay as much as you might think. I've personally only needed to whip out the microphone and the bug detector only a handful of times in my many hours of play. Granted, I haven't 100%ed the game necessarily, but I assumed I would be using them a little bit more than I actually did. But one specific instance that stood out to me as ridiculous and unnecessary was a section where Yagami enters a mildly dark room and you're forced into the first-person investigative mode to just look for a light switch. Pretty dumb. There is one specific gadget that is really special, and that's because it's an animal. Ranpo, the detective dog who sniffs out crimes, clues, and useful items. Once you meet him, you're allowed to call him out at basically any time while wandering the open world, and allow him to drag you to nearby criminal activity or some useful stuff discarded on the ground. He also comes in handy in investigations by using his nose to make progress. He's a nice, adorable addition to the Judgment world, but like with the other gadgets, he's very rarely truly necessary, which is a shame. And then there's stealth missions, which are brief, linear sequences where Yagami must avoid confrontation with enemies and sneak past them instead. It's a very straightforward, by-the-book system. Yagami is crouch-walking, there's conveniently placed stacks of boxes and crates to hide behind, and there's a couple of tools to distract enemies with, specifically a coin to make noise by tossing across the room a la Hitman, or smoke bombs that momentarily discombobulate guards. It is possible to make noise and draw attention, and you're also able to do takedowns that permanently remove foes from the area. They seriously just disappear, meaning there's no mechanic where you'll have to lift and relocate bodies. Frustratingly enough though, you're not allowed to do takedowns without distracting enemies with coins or bombs. You have to spend those resources to neutralize them, and that's kind of annoying, but at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. Stealth missions are essentially short little breaks between normal sleuthing and fighting. They're pretty shallow mechanically, but they don't feel out of place in a detective game. And then there's parkour, which might seem a bit out there, but considering Yagami's athleticism, job, and the franchise's unflinching attitude towards out there ideas, it's not all that strange a mechanic. Its implementation is somewhat similar in execution to stealth missions, though probably with a bit more depth. It does its job pretty well, but it feels like it's ultimately there to just give a bit of flavor to the gameplay formula, though there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that. Yagami can climb, shimmy, swing, and wall run, and the game offers several abilities that increase his grip strength, meaning he'll be able to hang on to things for longer, which is important because if you fall during these segments, it's back to the beginning for you. It's possible to take very short optional paths away from progress to get some decent items as well. It's a perfectly functional little challenge that pops up every once in a while, and does get a tiny bit tricky sometimes because the path forward isn't always obvious, and honestly, controls aren't super responsive, and you'll almost certainly fall off roofs and scaffoldings because you dare to move faster than a normal walk. But at the end of the day, I'd say it's a perfectly serviceable system. Nothing astounding, but decent gameplay flavor, like stealth missions. For anyone experienced enough with this franchise, one of the most obvious draws to it is side content, and this is where Lost Judgment truly goes above and beyond. It features a lot of the same stuff you would normally see in other Yakuza titles, like gambling games, darts, and the batting center, and even arcades filled with real-life Sega titles. In this instance, those titles are Motor Raid, Sonic the Fighters, Fighting Vipers, Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown, and other classics that have appeared in the series before. On top of that, there's even a Sega Master System that's usable in Yagami's office in Kamurocho, where you can start up and play both the English and Japanese versions of several real-life games, including Alex Kidd, Fantasy Zone, Secret Command, Enduro Racer, and more. There's also the return of drone racing, where you can build parts and customize your flying gadget to participate in Grand Prix. And the VR game Dyson Cube, where you play a board game style match against an AI and try to reach the finish line before they do. There's another game in the same VR arcade that you can unlock through a side case called Seiryo, which is a twin-stick shooter. Speaking of side cases, there's no shortage of those either. You can come across them by checking out the case board in the Ijincho office, or by looking up various keywords on the Chatter phone app. As usual, a lot of them are pretty goofy, which is a franchise staple. Considering the extremely serious and dark subject matter of the main story, the tonal whiplash might be a little bit stronger here than usual, but longtime fans won't have any trouble adjusting to that. But the true shining star of all the side content in the game is Seiryo High School. I mentioned before that it was a substantial new addition to the map of Ijincho, but it's also the most massive collection of narratively tied minigames and side cases the franchise has ever had. The high school has its own lengthy subplot tied to it, and I use the term subplot kind of lightly, and not because it's shallow or anything. On the contrary, the entire high school arc might even take longer to complete than a straight run-through of the main story. Let me explain. Fairly early on in the central narrative, Yagami meets a student named Amasawa, who is the president of the Mystery Research Club, which Yagami becomes a counselor for in order to make progress in his case. Once that happens, you're allowed to work with Amasawa to uncover a possible conspiracy surrounding a mysterious online figure known as the Professor, and their link to several students who have turned to a life of delinquency. To accomplish this, Yagami has to infiltrate several other clubs in the school, and every single one of them has some sort of minigame tied to them. And almost all of them are new original minigames created for Lost Judgment, and given an incredible amount of depth. The first club you infiltrate is the Dance Club, which, surprise, is where the rhythm game is, and it's actually really fun. There's 4 songs in total, each with 4 difficulties, then you select special freestyle moves to activate during the song for certain buffs. And it's possible to buy dance outfits out in the world to change Yagami's clothes for the real-time dance sequence that plays in the background. It's a very legit minigame that feels like way more effort was put into it than any of the karaoke minigames that we've ever seen in the franchise. If there's any complaint that I have, it's that sometimes the button prompts, especially the double button prompts where you hit 2 at the same time, occasionally blend in with the background, making them hard to see. Now granted, that might be my TV's brightness interfering though. Then you have the Robotics Club, which has a direct puzzle combat game associated with it, where you and the opposing side have 3 robots that must collect and place Tetris-style blocks on a grid. You must place your blocks next to each other, leaving no gaps. The team who covers most of the grid when the timer reaches 0 wins. Or, for an instant win, you simply have to make a line to your opponent's starting point and claim only 1 square. Furthermore, you can only control 1 robot on your team. The other 2 must be AI controlled. Sounds a little bit convoluted with me explaining it, but after a few rounds it clears itself up. This Robotics Club minigame is a very interesting idea, but there's one aspect where it falls apart completely: upgrading your robots. It's similar to how you upgraded pocket circuit cars back in Yakuza 0 or Kiwami 2, but even more tedious. In order to secure the materials you need to develop upgrades, you must either go out into the greater Ijincho area and visit multiple separate stores, or grind previously beaten matches. This is annoying because some materials can only be acquired through grinding. It's a totally unnecessary middleman that slaps on a totally superfluous layer of extra tedium. You can try to stubbornly beat the tougher enemies without upgrading your robots, but man, you are in for a hell of a frustrating time if you attempt that, because you will just straight up get bullied. An amusing coincidence considering the plot of the main storyline. This puzzle combat game is a fascinating idea, but it seriously needs some ironing out. After that, we have my personal favorite, the boxing gym. You would think that this game might simply stick to a slightly modified version of its own regular combat mechanics to make this work, but obviously RGG Studio doesn't fly like that. They went out of their way to create a completely new combat system that works specifically for boxing, and it is ridiculously fun. You have buttons for jabs, straights, and hooks, and they can all combo into one another for some aggressive offense, and you can direct them to the upper or lower body of the opponent. Plus, there's a big selection of abilities exclusive to the minigame. It's downright addicting, and this is the only club that I completed in one sitting, without taking a break and doing other things. Like all the other clubs, it has its own small storyline associated with it, and this one is particularly enjoyable to me because it's basically one giant Baki the Grappler reference. I love it. Then there's the Skateboard Delinquents, which is another enjoyable one. The minigame here is pretty straightforward, as it's basically QTEs in the form of skateboarding, though you do have some control over where you go in the park and when you want to ollie and grind. Basically, you hit a quarter pipe, and you hit the jump button at the right time, then mash a second button that pops up, and you collect points when you land back down. Keep this up while also collecting floating tokens around the park, and you'll gain some huge points. It's not difficult, and it serves as a pretty satisfactory distraction from other things. After completing the associated storyline, you can also do optional secondary missions and skate races. Then we have the Biker Gang. This one's probably a bit divisive because if you're a little too rambunctious and reckless, you'll end up having a bad time, and the so-called death races will end up pretty frustrating. Basically, each death race is divided into 2 phases. One against grunts who regularly attack you, and one against your actual opponent. You must defeat all grunts by ramming into them in order to initiate the death race with your main enemy. And from then on, it's basically a test of survival until you hit the boost right before the finish line. Like with past racing minigames in the Yakuza franchise, namely the taxi racing in 5, your opponent rubber bands like a motherfucker. There's sincerely no point whatsoever in attempting to gain a lead, because the game will rubber band them ahead of you soon after. The only way to guarantee a win is to boost into the finish line. It's dumb and kind of ruins the point of racing, but that's how it is. The good news is, there is bike customization. The bad news is, it's super shallow and you only have 1 upgrade per part, per bike, aside from the horns, which are purely cosmetic. But if you're the type of person who loves Bosuzoku, then you'll likely enjoy this minigame because it is Bosuzoku to the max. The Biker Gang also has one of the more extensive subplots tied to it, just like the Dancing Club, Robotics Club, and Boxing Gym. And then there's the Girls Bar, which is the game's Hostess Club substitute. The general idea is still the same. You walk in, order a drink, and chat the girl up. Eventually, you'll progress your relationship far enough to do a sub-story for her and basically finish her tiny arc. It's nothing super special, but like with most other minigames, it's a decent distraction from other stuff. The remaining school clubs are smaller, have shorter subplots, and utilize previously existing minigames as opposed to brand new ones created specifically for Lost Judgment. There's the photography club, which has, well, the photographing mechanic to take pictures of delinquent students. Then there's the secret casino, which obviously involves casino games like poker. And then there's the esports club, which features Virtua Fighter 5 Final Showdown, led by a character who looks a lot like Segata Sanshiro. As a fan of Virtua Fighter, I find the esports club to be pretty amusing. All in all, the Seiryo High School portion of the game strings all of these clubs together to create a large web of conspiracy around the unknown professor and the return of certain characters from the previous game. It's a massive treasure trove of content that you aren't even obligated to do, but you should do them because a lot of the stuff here is incredible. I have about 46 hours of total playtime as I write this review, and I must have taken about 20 of those hours to complete this entire high school subplot. That is not an exaggeration. There's almost an entire separate game's worth of content here, and RGG Studio made all of it completely optional. That is nothing short of absolutely fucking insane. It just goes to show that they are, without a doubt, the undisputed masters of side content. Their ambition regarding the optional stuff they put into their games is admirable and completely deserving of respect. And I wish more Western developers of open world games cared this much about offering content in a reasonably sized map instead of making massive, barren worlds with nothing to do. Overall, Lost Judgment is one hell of an offering. It has a gripping plot, fascinating new characters, fun combat with a whole new fighting style to utilize, nice graphics and solid performance, a great score, and an absolutely remarkable smorgasbord of side content, especially in the high school. It's a little bit rough around a couple small edges, but it's still such an amazing experience in the grand scheme of things. I enjoyed Judgment quite a bit, but this sequel really brings things to a whole new level. The way it takes advantage of the franchise's new home in Ijincho is spectacular. The future of this spin-off is still clouded in uncertainty, but even if it were to come to a sadly premature end, Lost Judgment is one hell of a point to end on. And I can always appreciate a game that lets me beat the shit out of annoying teenagers. As I was writing this review, franchise creator Toshihiro Nagoshi and longtime producer Daisuke Sato both announced their departures from RGG Studio and Sega. Their roles will be going to other experienced team members who have been around since the beginning. So while some people may worry about the future of the franchise, I see no reason to panic. It's a potentially new and exciting path we might be going down, and I look forward to the future. This concludes my review of Lost Judgment. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
Yakuza!